Hi everyone, Ashley here and welcome to another video on my YouTube channel. Today's video is super fun because it's part of the quarterly Lawn Fawn Fans YouTube Hop series, and this is our summer installment for 2021. So basically what this is a group of very talented crafters comes together and makes summer-inspired projects using Lawn Fawn products. So to see who else is participating in this hop and to check out their cards, definitely make sure to check out my video description down below this video, which has the full hop list. You'll also want to check them out because there's a giveaway associated with this hop, and more information about that will be down in that description box as well, so make sure to check that out. I highly encourage you to check out the other crafters in this hop. They're all so talented and they're going to be sharing some gorgeous creations. So without further ado, let's get into my card making for today. So for today's card, I am using a whole bunch of different Lawn Fawn products. And to see exactly which stamp sets I'm using on this card, check out the video description down below the video where I've listed everything, so you'll see exactly which stamp sets go into this card. I did use a bunch because I wanted a really fun and full summer beach scene. So Lawn Fawn has a lot of really great sort of beachy summer themed images to choose from, and I definitely had fun choosing from a lot of them. So check out that video description below to see exactly which stamp sets I used here. So as I've been talking, I've sort of shown what the final card is going to look like. So as you saw, it's a trifold card, which has 3 different panels, and each panel has its own little scene that sort of all blend together to make one big scene when you look at the whole thing together. And for this card, I really wanted to focus on these adorable squirrels that mostly come from the Lawn Fawn Let's Go Nuts stamp set, and I wanted them to be engaging in a whole bunch of different summery activities. So I stamped out also a scooter, which comes from one of the newer Lawn Fawn sets, Scootin by. So one of those squirrels will be riding on a scooter. I also stamped out a bunch of pineapples, which I thought was really beachy and fun. I stamped out a lot of different palm trees, a sandcastle, so some of the squirrels will be making a sandcastle, and I also stamped out a hammock, so one of the squirrels will be in a hammock. And I also stamped out the image of those 2 little cute squirrels hugging, and that is from another one of the more recently released Lawn Fawn stamp sets, Happy Hugs, which is super cute, and I thought they fit right in on this scene. So as you can see, I'm showing how I'm coloring a bunch of these images. I did stamp them all ahead of this video in some Copic friendly black ink. I used Gina Amalgam ink onto some Neenah Solar White cardstock, which is a really nice cardstock for Copic coloring. Now I'm just kind of zooming through and showing you some of the main images and how I colored them without sort of being too repetitive. So for example, I colored in a whole bunch of squirrels, but I didn't want to have you sit and watch all of them, so I just showed you how I colored a few of them and then I'll move on. Did the same with the pineapple, and now I'll do the same with a bunch of the rest of these images. If you do want to skip ahead and just see the rest of the card coming together after the coloring, you can also do that by just skipping ahead in the video. So for each of the images, I'm using a few different shades of the color. So for the squirrels, I use 3 different shades of brown. And what I typically do when I'm Copic coloring is I start with the darkest shade and put it in places where I think there will be shadow. Then I'll come in with the middle shade and blend it out. And then finally, I'll do the same with the lightest shade. What I typically do at that point is go back in with the darkest shade and add an extra level of dimension. Sometimes in some images I only use 2 shades. So for example, those pineapples just use 2 shades of orange. And that way it really is important, or it becomes a little bit more important, to come back with that darker shade and add an extra layer of dimension at the end. Because if you only have 2 shades, then it really helps to kind of really bring out those shadows by bringing in that darker shade again at the end and adding it as an extra layer of dimension. Now for these images, what I'm also doing as an extra detail is adding in some sort of cute little highlighting lines with a white gel pen. And I just find that this gives them sort of an extra cartoony look, which for these types of images I think is super cute. I don't always do it, but I always love it when I do it, so I really should try to do it more often. I think it's super cute, and it's something that a lot of crafters do, so certainly not the first person to do this at all, but it is a very cute effect. So for the sandcastle, I colored it in like you saw with a couple different shades of brown, and then something that I added was a little bit of a stippling effect. And I like to do this when I have sort of sand images, because I find it kind of just gives the look of sort of the grains of sand, which is really cute. So basically what I did is I just colored it normally. So I started with the dark shade, blended it with the light, came back in with the dark, and then with the dark I also came back in and added those little stipply dots. So I just think that's a really nice effect with sand. For the cocktail drink, I colored it in with some red shades to make it look like a really bright, fun, fruity cocktail. And now for these shells, I'm just coloring them in with some warm grays which is sort of my favorite color combination for shells. I just find it kind of gives that perfect shell color. So I'm just using, again, a couple different shades here, a darker and a lighter, and then blending out the dark with the light. Finally coming back in with the dark to add extra dimension. I will say for most of the images on this card, I focused on a few different colors that I thought were really bright and summery and beachy. So I used that bright red that you saw in the cocktail. I used sort of some bright oranges like on the pineapples. I used a lot of bright greens like I'm going to be using here on these palm trees. And then I used some bright turquoises. So I just thought that this was a really nice color combination and really nice for summer. I just wanted to make this card super bright and super summery. So I think that the color combination really worked in the end. For these trees, I just used 3 different shades of brown and sort of sequentially went from dark to light, sort of blending out each one as I went. I'm going to be doing a similar thing for the trees where I'm going to be using a dark shade of green. I think this is YG09. And then I'll come in with a lighter shade to sort of blend it out. I believe I use YG06 and then finish with YG01. I really like these YG colors for sort of tropical ferns because they're so bright and happy. By the way, you might have just noticed me also coming back in with a Copic multiliner, which is a thin black marker, just to fix up some of the stamping. And I do this a lot when I stamp out images and maybe they don't stamp perfectly or a little piece gets missed. It's nice to use that multiliner to just fill it in and make it look perfect. And I use the 0.5 Copic multiliner thickness. So they come in different thicknesses, essentially. And sort of the bigger you go, the more thick it is. So a 0.8 marker, for example, would be a bit of a thicker nib than a 0.5. So I personally find that the 0.5 is like the perfect thickness for these Lawn Fawn images, just with the sort of width of the lines that you get on these stamped Lawn Fawn images. The 0.5 Copic multiliner really suits that very well. So I use that marker if I ever need to sort of fix up any of the images. So I'm just finishing up coloring this lighthouse, and then after that I'm going to move on to coloring this umbrella. And for the umbrella, I wanted it to be multicolor and represent a lot of the colors that I was using in other images on the card. So I had one section of the umbrella be red, another be blue, another be orange, one be yellow, and one be green. So you kind of get a little bit of a flavor of each of the colors right on this umbrella, which I think is really, really cute. Now, this umbrella will be the last image that I share, my coloring, and after that I will move on to sort of building the rest of the card. But I will just say that the rest of the images I colored with the exact same technique using a lot of the same colors. So starting with that dark shade, blending it out with the light, and adding a third shade if I think it's necessary. Coming back in with the dark shade at the end to add extra dimension, and then adding that touch of detail with the white gel pen. There were a lot of images to color, and I took my time to finish the rest of them. I cut them out off camera, and now I can go ahead and start building the card itself. So for the card, I knew I wanted it to be a tri-panel, and I cut out the tri-panel base in 2 parts. So each panel is a square, so I cut out the length of 2 of the panels, and then I scored it down the middle, and I scored a little bit off to the side as well to act as sort of the hinge to add the third panel onto. Now each square is 5 inches by 5 inches. So for that first panel, I cut it at 5 inches by 10.5. Then I scored at 5 and I scored at 10. That way you get that 1/2 inch of overlap, which I scored to use as this little hinge. I'm adding some double-sided tape now to that 1/2 inch hinge, and I can add my third 5 by 5 panel directly onto that. And you'll see once I tape this down and sort of cut off the excess where the lip ends up being, you can see that this becomes a really nice trifold shape. And how it'll work is that you'll open up the front panel and you'll see sort of the inside 2 panels, and you'll be able to sort of lay the whole thing flat so it forms one big scene, which is really cool. So that is a whole thing, and you'll just have to sort of orient it in a way where you don't see that crease. You can make it sort of be on the back. Now I knew each of the 5 by 5 inch panels needed its own panel to go onto it. So I cut 3 more squares at 4.5 by 4.5 inches to leave a 1/4 inch white space around each panel. Then for each of the 3 panels, I cut some extra pieces to act in the scene. So I cut 2 hillside pieces and 1 ocean piece for each of the panels. And you can see here as I've laid them out, one of the things I did was kind of make sure that the hillsides and water lined up with each other across the panels. So as I cut the panel for one piece, I then sort of lined it up to make sure that I had the die in the right place to cut it for the next piece, so that it all looks like one continuous hillside and one continuous piece of water. So I just thought that was a really nice touch and something to keep in mind if you're building a card like this for yourself. Now I'm going to be blending onto all the panels to create the scenes, and I'm starting with the center panel. And for the center panel, I knew I wanted to have sort of a sunlit circle in the middle because I wanted to put the lighthouse here. So I kind of wanted it to be like the light coming out of the lighthouse, or it could just be sort of the light of the sun. So I cut a piece of copy paper down to the same size as that panel, so 4.5 by 4.5 inches. And I cut a circle into the middle with a die. So I just used a die to cut a circle right out of the middle of that panel. And then I lined that up with my piece, and it created that whole opening in the middle that I could blend some yellow Distress Oxide onto. So I used Squeeze Lemonade, and I just used my blending brush to blend that Squeeze Lemonade right through that open circle onto the panel. When that was done, I could peel the mask back, and then you were revealed with this panel with this yellow circle right in the middle. So I knew I wanted it to be in the sky, so then I came back in with a very light blue Distress Oxide ink. So this is Tumbled Glass. And again, I'm using my blending brush to sort of blend that directly onto the panel to form the sky. Now, as I get close to that yellow circle, I'm sort of blending over a little bit so that they do blend together just slightly. It's sort of blurring the edges of that circle so it's not so perfectly circular. It's a little bit blurred, and it almost looks like the sun is sort of just fading into the sky, which is exactly what I wanted. Now, if you're doing this at home, you do have to be careful not to blend over too much, because if you start blending more, you start getting green. So once you start blending the blue onto the yellow too much, you're going to get a green color. So I wanted to avoid that, and so I just sort of blended very softly over the edges, just very slightly, and that's how you get sort of that softened edge. Now I came back in with a second blue tone. This is Salvaged Patina, which is a slightly darker blue shade than Tumbled Glass. And I just added that to the top of the panel just to give the sky a little bit of dimension. So it wasn't just one flat color, it was two colors kind of blended together. Now I'm going on to the other panels, and this is now the very leftmost panel. So again, that panel with the yellow circle in it was the center panel of the trifold. This is now the leftmost panel of the trifold. And the leftmost and rightmost panels will be the same in terms of the background. So I'll just show you one. And what I did for these is I just blended some Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink together with some Salvaged Patina. So this will match the background of that first panel. It just won't have that yellow circle in the middle. So I'm just kind of going back and forth between the two blue shades to kind of blend them together. And that is pretty much it. Like I said, I did that for both panels, but I'm just going to skip over to the end. Here you can see that rightmost panel is now blended and good to go. So I also wanted to add a little bit of extra detail and pattern to these backgrounds. So I took the Stars and Dots stencil. I forget if that's what it's actually called, but I'll have the name for it down in the description box below. But it's a stencil by Lawn Fawn that has all these stars and dots. And I took some Lawn Fawn Yeti ink, which is a white pigment ink, and I'm just dabbing that right onto these card panels. So what I will say about this is that at the end of the day, this ends up being very subtle. If I could go back, I probably wouldn't bother with this step at all because it took a lot of time to do this on all three panels, and it didn't really end up showing very much. I think that was probably for a combination of a few factors. I think it's just the fact that the pigment ink, the white pigment ink, is not super strong. It's pretty faint. These spots that it's going through are very small, and the background that it's going onto is already very light. So there's not much contrast there. So I did do that on all three panels, but at the end of the day, it didn't really have a huge effect. Okay, so now I'm moving on to the hillsides, and I'm doing this for each of the three panels. This is the first one. So for each of the three panels, I have two hillsides, and I'm blending them to look like sand. So I used a combination of Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink, which is the darker brown, and Antique Linen Distress Oxide ink, which is the lighter brown. And I'm just blending them together, sort of going back and forth to make sure they mix nicely. And I put the Vintage Photo towards the top and the Antique Linen towards the bottom of each of the hillsides. So I just wanted the darker section to be at the top, kind of just to look like some dirt or sand had been there, kind of from the little critter's feet, and then it kind of blends out to a lighter color towards the bottom. I really love this color combination for sand. I actually think it's very realistic. For each of these panels, I also did some ink splatter. So I just put some Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink onto an acrylic block, added a bit of water, and then splattered it out onto my panels with a paintbrush. So I did that again for all three panels. Finally, I'm blending the water pieces for each of the panels, and for this, I'm just taking some Mermaid Lagoon Distress Oxide ink and blending it in from the bottom of the panel up towards the top, allowing it to fade out a little bit to white. And I feel like this just gives a little bit of dimension without being too busy because they're such small pieces. So again, I did that for all three of the panels, and then once I have all of the pieces blended for all three panels, I can start gluing them all together and assembling them into the scenes. So for this, I'm just taking some liquid glue and gluing the pieces together one by one. And the important thing to note here is that I'm leaving a little bit of space towards the top of each panel without glue. And that allows me to just tuck little images in behind each of the pieces and have space to do that. Now off camera, I went ahead and put the panels out onto my workspace and arranged all of the images onto them in a way that I thought was really cute. So that's what you're looking at now. I've already gone ahead and sort of put all the pieces together where I think that they look good to make a cute little scene. This is definitely one of the most fun parts to do in real life, but it's probably one of the most boring parts to watch someone doing, so I didn't show it in the video. But I will say it's super fun when you have all your images and you have your scenes, and then it's sort of like a puzzle of where do I put everything in a way that looks really cute and looks really full. So for each of these images, since I have them all already sort of laid out, all I have to do is go through and glue them all down one by one. And I'm using a combination of liquid glue for some of the pieces and foam squares for some of the other pieces. The important thing to note is because this is a trifold card, I could only use foam on the pieces that will be on the panel on the front of the card. And for the rest of the panels that are going to be inside the card, I could only use glue, no foam. And that's because I wanted the card to be able to close completely and not have any foam sort of obstructing the card from closing. So I didn't want any foam on the inside of the card. So for the front panel, I could use foam on some of the images. And for the second two panels, I just used glue to glue everything down. And it looked totally fine. There's so much dimension in these panels to begin with, you really don't need foam. Okay, so one of the last steps of this card is to add the sentiments. So I cut out 3 strips of pearlescent vellum. They're each 3/4 of an inch tall and just slightly longer than the card panels. And I'm just stamping out a different sentiment on each one in black ink. So the first one says Scootin by to say, the last one says have a happy day, and the middle one will say Aloha. And then I'm going to just take each of these strips and glue them onto the card panels. How I do that is I lay it out so that it's centered on the card panel, and I add a little bit of double-sided tape to either edge. Once I'm happy with the placement, I can then fold each edge over the back of the panel and then stick it right down with that double-sided tape. So just pull the release paper off and stick it down. And this is a super easy way to adhere vellum strips to your card panels because you don't end up seeing any of the adhesive through the strip or through the vellum. Now sometimes I like to add sort of an anchoring piece to the front behind the words, and you can do that and you don't really see it either, so that works as well. Okay, finally it's time to assemble the card. I'm just taking a little bit of liquid glue behind each of the panels and then gluing it down onto the card base that I built earlier, which is that trifold white card base. So you can see here that little white edge that's created because these panels were slightly smaller than those squares of the card base itself. And I like that because it allows room for those folds, so it allows the card to fold easily without impacting your panel at all. So it's good to kind of incorporate those white edges when you're making a card like this. So that is it. That is the card completed. You can see here as I fold it up and open it up how the trifold mechanism works. And honestly, I really love it every way. I love looking at each panel individually, and I love looking at the whole thing as a full scene. And I think one of the things that is most important about the full scene is really having those edges line up in the background. So making the hillsides really look continuous, I think really helps make it look like a full continuous scene, which I think is really cute. So I'm just showing off each panel on its own here. There's so much detail that I've added that I really love, and I just love how fun and summery this card is. So I think it's the perfect addition to a summer YouTube hop. So thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. It's a bit of a long one. I really appreciate you being here. Again, check out that video description for more information about the hop, go check out the other creations, and check out the information on the giveaway, which is really fun. I hope that you had a great time watching today. I hope you learned a little bit about Lawn Fawn cards and stamps and how to use them. And if you want to see more of my cards, make sure to head over to my Instagram account, which is also linked down in that video description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!